This is Diablo 4. It sold over 12 million units in its first month and saw a fantastic number of players and loads of positive reviews. This is Path of Exile 2. It was recently released in early access, where it sold an unprecedented 1 million units and had just an incredibly high number of players in its first few months. As you probably know, Path of Exile and Diablo are action role-playing games, and their launch success should speak to a genre which is at its peak and is only going to keep getting better. Except we've seen this before, and it may well be the sign of a genre on a tipping point towards a design death spiral. And it all starts with a simple problem. But to better understand the problem, we need to know how the genre began, what some pivotal moments were, and how it came to be in this position. Let's go all the way back to December 31st, 1997. This was the day that the very first Diablo game was released. Developed by Blizzard North, it was an attempt to bring faster, more responsive gameplay to the ARPG genre, which was replete with turn-based titles. By combining the depth of core RPG mechanics such as rich character and item progression, with real-time combat mechanics rarely seen at the time, and a dark narrative, this gothic romp through the caverns under a church delivered a gameplay experience the audience desperately needed, but didn't know that they even wanted. Combine that with multiple classes and playstyles to choose from, and a procedural level generation system that ensured every run presented the player with something new to overcome, it hit the perfect mark of progression and customization to solve a problem. The ARPG genre was born. Looking back, Diablo was remarkably simple. Only 3 classes, which shared many of the same spells, a small number of enemies and levels compared to today, and a comparatively small list of items. The magic of Diablo came from something RPGs in particular do extraordinarily well: systemic interaction. By designing the game in such a way that various elements of the game could interact with each other, and then injecting randomization into that through the loot, the true fun of Diablo wasn't in the scale, it was in the possibility of the next session being the perfect run. It did well. And then, in 2000, Diablo 2 arrived. After a period of relatively horrific crunch and many sleepless nights, the same team released a more than worthy successor into a gaming landscape that hadn't really seen any games like the first Diablo since its launch. Diablo 2 contained more of, well, everything. 5 classes, all with their own unique set of customizable skills. A deeper and much more varied loot system, with more item slots to fill and affixes to perfect. A crafting system in the form of the Heradric Cube. A story which took you beyond the confines of Tristram to explore more of the world of Sanctuary, broken up into multiple acts with various art styles and enemies to fight, and more. It made sense. The natural inclination when releasing a sequel to a game is to add more. It simply wouldn't do to just provide the players with the same thing but better. Without layering on extra content, you risk missing audience expectations, and expectations for Diablo 2 were high. For any other teams who were looking at making their own Diablo-inspired game, a new bar had been set. The playing field had expanded. It would be 12 years before Diablo 3 arrived, and in that time, various other contenders appeared, all layering on new forms of content and features, be it ever more classes to choose from, bigger stories to discover, or endless mapping systems. Every game added more. And this layering on of more and more features is the core issue of one of the problems the genre faces today. An ever-escalating baseline of content expectations that pushes new features onto competitors or sequels in order to maintain the status quo. This results in escalating team sizes, longer development timeframes, and games which start costing an ever-increasing amount to develop. But the real problem would begin in 2012, with the release of Diablo 3. For various reasons, dominantly the auction house and user security against black market hackers, Diablo 3 was an always online game. Being always online also unlocks other possibilities, such as monetization. Diablo and the genre as a whole was no longer just a game, it was becoming a live service. Path of Exile naturally went in the same direction and amplified this problem when they released new seasons every 12 weeks, with each season containing optional monetized cosmetics. Diablo Immortal, then Diablo 4, simply doubled down on this. As soon as a game becomes a live service, it changes how the design for almost everything is approached. The philosophy and mindset of design changes to one focused on bringing players back to the game repeatedly. The overriding goal becomes keep players playing, keeping them in the game so that, on occasion, they can purchase new cosmetics or battle passes or seasons or whatever. This shift generally means the game will have many systems all layered on top of each other in order to keep players looping through, always feeling like they're progressing when really they're on a treadmill. Naturally, those systems start to become tailored to an audience that is most likely to keep playing the game. Some might call them the hardcore audience. These are the players who likely play the game the most, have the most experience, and are also most likely to share their thoughts and opinions. There's a good chance that we're one of them. Now, I want to be really clear. Having a vocal minority audience is an absolute blessing, and the design team should absolutely be listening to them. They're a strong source of effective, meaningful feedback. But just like any feedback, the response to it needs to be balanced. That audience, while extremely well-intentioned, can also cause disaster if they become the sole source of directional feedback that the design team is leveraging to determine what features to build next and what they should look like. The features end up tailoring themselves to the most hardcore of your audience, to an audience who will ask for something that makes sense to them, but may not make sense to a larger audience. That may seem like it's a good idea. Why not create systems for someone who is playing your game a lot? The downside to doing that is that the audience is, by its very nature, quite small. And that's what Path of Exile 2 appears to be doing. The skill tree, the end game, these are all systems which are tailor-made for a hardcore audience, which is also the smallest audience. This is okay. Heck, I love games which have obscure systems or janky implementation of things. But it's not if the game is also costing an inordinate amount to make. Expensive games need massive audiences, otherwise they simply can't make any money, and it's unsustainable. The two leading titles are now operating at extremely high budgets with ever-escalating content requirements, building games designed for smaller and smaller audiences. And this is how a genre dies. Now, of course, you're thinking, but this is all simple conjecture and theory crafting. And you'd be right, if we hadn't seen similar things happen to other genres. There was a time when point-and-click adventure games were all the rage. Games like Escape from Monkey Island, Grim Fandango, or Myst were the most reliable games out there. In these games, players are presented with environments with limited interaction objects and inventories that they can use to collect and store items that they find. To progress through the game, players must solve puzzles, using those objects by, as you guessed, pointing and clicking. Combining strong storytelling with rewarding puzzle solving seemed like a formula that would last forever. The problem began when the developers started focusing on their most vocal audience. The players who posted on forums a lot would typically want harder, more complicated puzzles to solve, and the developers followed their request. So much so that eventually the puzzles became so hard and obscure that most players found them too frustrating. Rather than being a light-hearted challenge to solve, it became a guessing game of what random item connects to what random object to unlock the next puzzle. They designed themselves into obscurity by over-focusing on the request of their vocal minority. A similar thing happened to real-time strategy games. RTS games like Warcraft 2, Dark Reign, or Command & Conquer were about appealing to the fantasy of being a grand general commanding dozens and hundreds of troops in a battle against an enemy. Your pretty typical army toy soldier fantasy. Over time, however, these games leaned into the competitive nature of the game. The multiplayer, especially the competitive variant, offered players endless gameplay, while the developers didn't need to invest a lot of money on content. StarCraft 2 became the dominant goal for the genre, and its focus on competitive multiplayer and esports drove the idea of APM, or actions per minute, to be the influencing factor in the design of the game. Unfortunately, very few players can actually compete at that level. Very few players are able to effectively perform the number of actions and decisions necessary in order to compete. And new players quickly get stomped by even slightly better players. The skill curve is very aggressive, and the skill ceiling is extremely high. Again, this resulted in a dramatic narrowing of the potential audience of the game. The genre became known not for delivering the fantasy of controlling an army, but for being an ultra-highly competitive esport. The total addressable audience for RTS games, already relatively small, shrank even further. And look, there are so many examples of games which are worse because of live service. I kind of feel like it's already been covered to death, so I'm not going to go into it here. So unfortunately, we can pretty clearly see that the ARPG genre is in a similar position as RTS and point-and-click adventure games were. Does that mean it's all over? Maybe not, because there's one more genre that this has happened to, and it shows us what might actually come from all of this. Magic the Gathering Online seemed to make perfect sense. Take the card collection gameplay and social setups of the in-person game and transition it to an online service. Magic, being turn-based, translates quite easily to the digital space. And even though the functionality of the translation was fine, the reception wasn't. Many of the game systems that are core to the rules of Magic, such as interrupts, which work really well in person, simply don't translate well into a social environment where you aren't sitting across a table from your opponent. The gameplay becomes slow and frustrating. It lacks much of the psychological reward. Collectible card games on the computer seem to have failed. Yet a few incredibly talented developers at Blizzard saw this and realized it was an opportunity. Like many game designers, they loved playing Magic. They loved it so much that it made them ask the question, why doesn't this work well online? This drove them to design and develop a card game that captured the essence of the experience of collecting and building decks, while getting rid of all the frustrating components of the rules that simply didn't work well on a computer. There's no interrupts in Hearthstone. It just isn't fun. This successful translation of a core fantasy into an online space shows us what's possible with ARPGs and gives us an idea of what might come next. It shows us that, though a genre is unlikely to die, it must evolve in order to survive, and that's what I believe we're on the verge of witnessing. The audience will fracture and focus, and this is a good thing. On the one hand, we'll have the ARPG games as we know them today, which continue to appeal to the hardcore audience. And on the other, we'll have smaller, more digestible, more condensed experiences that appeal to a similar but different audience. Games more like the original Diablo. Path of Exile is unlikely to ever go away entirely. The way that GGG has approached the design and development of the game is phenomenal, and I truly believe that they have, rightfully, claimed the throne from Blizzard. Because of this though, it's also unlikely that we'll ever see a Diablo 5. In the same way that we'll never see a sequel to World of Warcraft, Diablo 4 expansions and seasons will just continue on and on until the audience is so small that Microsoft decide to shutter it, as it won't make financial sense to continue it on. PoE 2 will also more than likely continue to add seasons, but it won't make sense to scale a team to create too much more content. Just like we saw with PoE, the team will focus on clever reuse of existing content to keep the seasons fresh. PoE 2 will be to ARPG what StarCraft 2 is to RTS. While the more hardcore audience is being served by PoE and Diablo 4, there will be a large swath of the audience who don't fit that description, that desire a similar experience without the, let's call it, systemic overhead or time commitment required from those games. They still seek the fulfilling action combat, the progression, the loot runs, and the seasonal variety, but they don't want it to feel like a job. They want something closer to what Diablo 1 offered. This is where we'll see an opportunity for growth in the genre, and where we can already see hints at it from a place I certainly didn't expect: Bullet Heavens. Games like Vampire Survivors are extremely simple and carry very little similarities to the deep progression of a game like Diablo. At least that's what I thought. With recent games like Death Must Die, Halls of Torment, Jotun Slayer, they're all making attempts to bring that Diablo loot progression into the experience. They don't do it all terribly well, and they each do something a little better than the others, but none of them really nail the formula in a way that Diablo did. At least not yet. Beyond Bullet Heavens, we also see hints of this with games like Hades, Death's Door, Heroes of Hammerwatch 2, or other similar top-down roguelikes. Is this a foregone conclusion? Of course not. And there's a great deal that needs to be added by these types of games to accomplish it. But all it will take is one team who can bring those elements together, and they may well be able to define a new type of ARPG. What about you? What do you think of the state of ARPGs? Do you think they'll simply continue to grow and evolve, or will we see them fracture into smaller audiences? Let me know in the comments below. For now though, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.